Good morning, dear students. Today we are going to discuss on this session some of the miscellaneous sources of collecting primary data, and also we are going to discuss on the sources of secondary data. If you can remember the whole process of research till now, a few of the things that we have discussed. The first, we started with identification of the problem, then we saw how to define the problem and what are the different precautions that the researcher should take when he selects a problem, especially from an academic research point of view. Once the researcher is well aware of the problem, then to understand the problem, to have a broader perspective of the problem, the researcher does intensive literature review. So we saw the second stage in the research process, the literature review. In the literature review, we had seen how important is the literature review for the researcher, which helps him to know the different variables taken by the earlier researchers. What are the different contributions made by the other researchers to the problem? What are the different statistical techniques which are used by the other researchers? What is the sample size? What is the population? What is the time spent? What is the money which was involved in doing the research? So all these are some of the aspects that a researcher will try to understand by doing the literature review. So once a literature review is done, when the researcher has awareness about the problem, then he moves to the other concept. That's the hypothesis formulation. In hypothesis formulation, we have seen that a researcher tries to give a tentative relationship between the variables. He gives a tentative assumption, and where he selects few variables and then tries to establish certain relationship, and then in the form of hypothesis statements, he tries to present it. We had seen a few aspects here. One is called alternate hypothesis, where the researcher is trying to establish that there is a relationship between the variables which are taken in the hypothesis statement. And the other side of the hypothesis is the null hypothesis, where the researcher is trying to establish that there is no relationship between the variables. Now we have understood that why a researcher should formulate the hypothesis, and especially why alternate and null hypothesis. We had seen that by taking these two kinds of hypothesis, that is alternate and null hypothesis, here researcher is trying to be impartial, researcher is trying to be unbiased. That's one of the main purpose behind formulating the hypothesis statement, especially both null and alternate hypothesis. And very important, we have seen that the hypothesis should be workable, it should be testable. The variables which are taken under consideration for formulating the hypothesis should be able to be measured. Unless you cannot measure the variables, subjecting it to statistical analysis becomes very difficult. So these are some of the things that we have seen in hypothesis. And then we move to the sampling design or research design, especially the research design as a bigger concept. So we saw identification of the problem, then we move to the literature review, then hypothesis statement, and then we move to the research design. And especially we have seen in hypothesis, especially in case of exploratory research, when the researcher is not aware of the variables, when the researcher is not having any knowledge about the problem is very new, then it is very difficult to formulate the hypothesis. But in case of a descriptive research or a causal research, as the variables are very clearly defined and the problem is very clearly defined, it is very easy to formulate the hypothesis. So in case of exploratory research, the purpose is to develop a hypothesis at the end of the research. Whereas in case of a descriptive research or a causal research, the purpose is to test the hypothesis. So please remember these two aspects in hypothesis. Then we move to the research design. We also saw that once the problem is identified, once the literature review is done, and your hypothesis is established or it is stated clearly, then your foundation for the research is laid. And once the foundation is laid, now the researcher has to build upon this foundation. That's called research design. It's a concept, it's a framework of the entire research. It's a blueprint of the research we have seen, where different aspects are involved. Starting from the statement of the problem, You have objective of the research, the population which is chosen for the research, the sample size, and sampling techniques which will be chosen, then the sources of data that will be selected to collect the data, statistical techniques that will be used in the research, the time available to do the research, and the cost, if any, is involved in the research, the skills required to do the research. So all these are the different aspects that has to be included in the research design. That's why we call it as a blueprint of the entire research. And then we move to a very specific aspect of the research design was the sampling design, how to do the sampling. We had seen two aspects there. One is sampling survey, and then we had seen census survey. We saw the difference between these two also, where in census survey, where the researcher studies every element of the population, whereas in sample survey, researcher takes only few elements of the population. He selects few samples. And we had seen few techniques of sampling survey. There are two techniques. One is probability sampling and non-probability sampling. We also call it random sampling and non-random sampling. In case of random sampling, we saw that every element selected here from the population has equal opportunity of being selected. And how to select samples from the population, we had seen few techniques. First one was simple random sampling, which can be done by a lottery method or by random tables method, or numbers can be generated through computers. Then we saw as the sample size increases, as the population size increases, even the technique also changes. Then you have systematic random sampling or systematic probability sampling, where equal interval is given between the samples and samples are selected. Then we saw something about stratified sampling. When the population is bigger, then you have to divide the stratas. Then we saw about cluster sampling. So what is the difference between stratified sampling and cluster sampling? In stratified sampling, the stratas which are prepared by or which is selected by the researcher, there is homogeneity within the strata. Whereas in cluster sampling, when the clusters are made or they are selected by the researcher, there is a heterogeneity existing within the group. We also saw that clusters are always naturally existing. So there is very less possibility for the researcher to actually make the clusters. There is no necessity of making the clusters, or they are naturally existing. Whereas in stratified, as the objective is to get homogeneous uh, elements in the framework, here researcher has to spend time. So the objective of making stratus and the objective of making clusters, so they're totally different. So the objective of making stratus is to achieve accuracy of the data, whereas the objective of researcher in cluster sampling is to uh, reduce the cost involved in making the stratas or clusters. So it's economical. Stratified sampling involves little time, whereas cluster sampling, as the clusters are naturally existing, it consumes less time and less money. For example, if the researcher wants to study 100 houses in a particular geographical area, all the 100 houses in that particular area are naturally existing. So he has to take all the elements in the cluster. So we had seen in the previous sessions how the clusters are made. So that's about stratified sampling and cluster sampling. But as again the population size increases and the sample size also increases, then we go to the multi-stage sampling, where at different stages the samples are selected. We had seen with the examples. In multi-stage sampling, here we can see the sample size is clearly defined. How much sample each stage the researcher has to select is clearly defined. Whereas the last technique, which is called as a sequential sampling, in this case, there is no predetermination of the sample size. It is not predetermined. Here, researcher, unless he is not satisfied with the representativeness of the sample that he is selecting, he continues to select the sample. As long as he doesn't get the true representativeness from the samples he is selecting, he continues to select the samples. Once the researcher, okay, he is satisfied that yes, he's got the true representativeness of the entire population now, he stops selecting the samples. That is called sequential sampling. So the difference between a multi-stage sampling and sequential sampling is in multi-stage sampling, the sample size is clearly predetermined. Whereas in the sequential sampling, it is not determined in advance. So that's the main difference between sequential and multi-stage sampling. So that is about probability sampling. Then we saw about non-probability sampling, where the researcher's personal bias is involved, like it could be a judgment sampling or purposive sampling, or it could be a quota sampling, or it could be a snowball sampling. So we have seen in detail all these techniques, where the commonality of all these features is there is a personal bias. Purposefully, the researcher is selecting. And we also saw that these non-probability techniques are used when the research is exploratory in nature. As the samples are not readily available, the researcher has to purposefully select the samples. So in most of the exploratory research, non-probability sampling is used, whereas in case of descriptive and other types of research like causal research, we use probability sampling, where sample size is clearly defined, where the problem is clearly defined. So that's what we have seen in the sampling survey. After that, we moved to the collection of data. Once the sampling design was done, we moved to the collection of data. There we had seen primary and secondary sources of data. In the previous session, we had seen about 4 important techniques of collecting data in the primary data. The first was the observation method, a very strong tool to collect the data, primary data. So we have seen what is observation, especially what is scientific observation, and we had seen different types of observation. Then we saw about interview method. We had seen again what is interview. We have different types of interview, how the interview has to be designed, what are the questions to be asked in the interview. So these are different aspects which are involved in the interview. We also saw some pros and cons of interview method also. Then we have a third method, which is called as questionnaire method. Again, a very widely used method because of the technological development, computers, internet. There is a wide usage of questionnaire, especially the electronic questionnaire. So we have discussed about how to frame the online questionnaire also through Google Forms. We can do even through Google Survey also. There are many other tools that we can use to prepare the online questionnaire. And then we saw about what kind of questions to be asked, what should be the sequence of the questions. So all that things we saw in the questionnaire method. And we also saw about scheduling method. That is the last, one of the last technique that we had seen in the collection of primary data, schedule method, where the researcher appoints enumerators, where enumerators on behalf of the respondents, they collect the data. Sometimes they help the respondents to collect the data. So there is a mediator between a researcher and the respondent who is called as enumerator. Whereas in questionnaire method, there is no such mediator. Directly the researcher sends the questions and respondents fill in and send. Only literate or educated respondents can be selected in a questionnaire method. Where in case of schedule method, even people who are not able to understand the question also can be selected, because the enumerator explains the respondents how to fill the questionnaire. So those were some of the sources of collecting primary data. Observation method, you have interview method, you have questionnaire method, and then we have schedule method. There are other methods also we'll see in the later sessions, but these were the 4 important techniques which are used. In interview method, we also had seen about the personal interview and the telephonic interview. So both the differences also we had seen. And then we moved further for the conclusion part. But there are some other miscellaneous techniques which can be used for selecting data in primary source. Now, let me share with you the screen. In today's session, we will be looking at miscellaneous. I hope you can see the screen. So in today's method, we will be trying to understand some of the other methods of collecting primary data and the secondary sources also. Okay. So let us go to the miscellaneous methods. Okay. So we have the first aspect here. It's called as warranty cards. So what is this warranty cards, which is used by most of the companies to collect the primary data? You can see on the screen there. Sometimes they look like postal sized cards. You must have seen that when you buy the products. They are used by the dealers of consumer durables especially to collect information regarding the product. So whenever the dealers or the company they sell their product, there will be a card of kind of a paper or a card along with the product where the customers have to fill that and then give it back to the dealers or the one who is selling, the vendors or the company. And that will become a source of data again for the dealers or the company, which gives a first-hand information of how the customers feel about the product, what is their perception regarding the product. So that is one of the other technique which is used. Then you have a distributor or store audits. Then this also can be used. Now this is performed by distributors themselves and sometimes the manufacturers also through the salesmen at regular intervals. So the salesmen at regular intervals they try to talk to the customers here and try to understand or try to audit about the customer perception or customer preference or customer attitude towards the products. So that's one of the method which can be used. Pantry audits. Now here the investigator collects an inventory of types, quantities and prices of commodities consumed. So it's very specific in nature here. The one who is collecting the data here, uh, the company or the dealer, they are collecting the inventory on types of products which are purchased by the consumer, the quantities of the products which are purchased by the consumer, or price of the commodities. So all these areas are captured through these audits, and that becomes a source of information for the company. Then you have consumer panels here. This is an extension of the previous method where detailed daily records of the customer consumption pattern is recorded, and it is same available to the investigator or the researcher. Now here actually the customers are arranged to collect the data. Here the researcher has to predetermine which are the customers he is going to choose, and then he has to collect data from these customers over the period of time about their purchasing pattern of the types, quantities, or prices of the product that they choose. So these are some of the techniques which can be used to collect the primary data. We can use even projective techniques also. Why these projective techniques are used? Sometimes some techniques will not be able to capture the underlying intentions, desires of the customer, which are unseen, which are invisible. So projective techniques helps to capture such underlying motives, urges, or intentions of the customers. And as it is related to motives or urges or intentions, most of such projective techniques are developed by psychologists, which helps to understand the perception of the customer. So there are different types of such techniques, projective techniques. Here, most of the times, your respondents unconsciously they are trying to share their attitudes or feelings about a subject under the study. In that way, these techniques are designed, and especially in the motivational studies, such projective techniques are very useful. Now, these are some of the types of projective techniques which can be used. Okay. We have word association test. Now, in this word association test, as the name itself says, different words are given to the customers, and the customers have to associate all these words and come out with a final picture. So here it need not be a customer; it could be anyone who is a respondent in the researcher. When the researcher is using word association tests, so he has to associate all the words, and that helps the researcher to understand what is there in the mind of the respondent. For example, a simple example could be a tree, a car, a pencil, a cycle. These are four words which are given to the respondent, and the respondent has to relate all these four words and come out with some meaning out of it. So that helps us to know what is the attitude of the customer, what he prefers, what is his preference. So this is one attempt to understand the motives and urges of the respondents. Then you have cartoon tests. We see cartoons in newspaper, magazines, in TV channels, and different people interpret different ways these cartoons. So that also shows their attitude. So some cartoons are also presented to the respondents, and they have to give a meaning out of the cartoon, which helps us to understand their attitude and the perceptions. Then you have sentence completion test. As the name itself says, there will be incomplete sentences which are given to the respondents. They have to complete the sentence. That will help again to know their attitude. For example, sentence could be, I like this product because. So because they have to continue that sentence. So that helps the researcher or the investigator to know what is there in the mind of the customer or the respondent. So that's called sentence completion test. Then you have third person techniques. Now in this third person techniques here, respondents are observed or respondents are tested here. What is their perception about the product or service by including a third person? For example, what your neighbor buys, what are the preferences of your neighbors. Okay. So here neighbor becomes a third person. So the respondent is trying to actually understand what his neighbor prefers. In this way, a respondent is actually revealing his attitudes, his perceptions. So that is a third party techniques which also can be used. Then you have role playing. We all know this is a very popular technique to instill the concept of empathy. So the respondents are asked to play the role of other positions or other roles where they have to put themselves in the other's shoes and try to think like them. So in this process, the respondents, they demonstrate their attitude, their perception, their desires, their urges, their motives. In that way, that becomes an important source of data for the investigator. Then finally, you have picture interpretation and storytelling, which is usually used among children. They are given some pictures and they have to associate all the pictures and they have to narrate a story. So this helps to understand what is the attitude, the perception, the motives of the person who is narrating it. So these are some of the techniques which are called as projective techniques, which dives deep into the mind of the customer or the respondents and try to know what they think, what they feel, what is the perception. So this is called as a projective technique, which are used mostly in the attitude studies and the motivational studies. So those are some of the examples. Then that's about the primary data. So till now we had seen what is primary data and how important is primary data, especially if it is exploratory research. And we had seen different ways of collecting the primary data, starting from observation method. We have seen interview method, then we have seen questionnaire method, including telephonic method, and then we have seen schedule method, and we had seen now some of the other miscellaneous methods which can be used. Very important is the projective techniques, which are used in qualitative research, where it is very difficult to capture the data, it is very difficult to quantify the data. In case of motivational studies, in case of leadership studies, in case of satisfaction studies, we usually use projective techniques to actually exactly reveal the inner motivations of the respondents. I hope you're clear with all the aspects of the primary data. Then we move to the sources of secondary data. Most of us, we depend and rely on secondary data. So what is secondary data? So let us try to understand something about secondary data. Here is a one quote given by Isaac Newton. I'll read it for you. If I have seen farther than others, it is because I have stood on the shoulders of giants. If I have seen farther than others, it is because I have stood on the shoulders of giants. So here giants, it speaks about their achievements, their contributions. So Isaac Newton says that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants and depending on them. I'm continuing in their footsteps. I'm taking the help of the earlier giants, and that is why I'm able to see farther. It also signifies the importance of the secondary data. So let us move now forward and try to understand different aspects of secondary data. You take any research, whether it is exploratory research or a descriptive research or the causal research, you take any types of research, it actually always starts with secondary data. Sometimes we in exploratory research we think that we directly go to the primary. No, even in the exploratory research, if you want to understand the problem, you have to go for the secondary data. Example, this coronavirus. Coronavirus is a new virus. When it came, doctors did not know what it is, so they had to refer back to the books, they had to refer back to the previous scientific studies, they had to go back to the previous such viruses which had come, uh, and then they had to understand about this virus. So even in case of exploratory research, actually it starts with secondary data. A researcher, to have an understanding about problem, whether it is exploratory research or a descriptive research, he starts with secondary data, and then based on the understanding he continues his research. So that's very important insight in the collection of secondary data. So please understand that. So what we do in secondary data is very simple. We did not discuss much here. Here data is collected and is collected by somebody else. So I am referring their data for my project. So it is not my data, it is not my contributions, but I am referring to others' data, and then I am trying to get some insights from that data. And whenever I take others' data, we have seen how important is referencing. I have to acknowledge that I have taken from this and this source in a right way. So in referencing section, we had seen how we have to acknowledge it and how we have to avoid plagiarism here. So plagiarism possibility is very much high when we go for the secondary data, as we are copying from, as we are taking from already collected data. So we should always be very careful that we are very ethical in doing our research, especially when we take from others' data. Secondary data usually are historical and already assembled. So it's very a basic aspect of secondary data. It is already done by somebody else, so it becomes a historical data. Even one day before, if somebody has collected, it becomes a historical data, and already it is assembled by others. They require no access to respondents or subjects. So I did not again go back to the respondents who have collected the data, because as already I have the data which is contributed by them, there is no access required to the respondents as it is there in the primary data. In case of primary data, the researcher has to contact the respondents. That's the primary data we have seen, first-hand information. Whereas in secondary data, as it is a second-hand information, as the information or data is readily available, the researcher need not again contact the respondents or the subjects. So that's one of the important insights. What is the use of secondary data? We had seen some of the benefits of primary data. It's a first-hand information. We can get accurate information. It's reliable information. And now let us see some of the benefits of secondary data. One of the important advantage is its availability. Its availability. It's readily available. Either it's in a book or a journal or an article or internet source. So its availability is one of the important advantage. Whereas in case of primary, the researcher has to go to the respondent and collect. It is not readily available. Obtaining secondary data is almost always faster and less expensive than acquiring primary data. We have seen already in primary data this difference. Sitting at home, I can browse the information. So the speed of getting the secondary data is very faster. And it is very less expensive also, because now the data charges also very less. So it's very easy to refer to the quantum of information in a very less time. That's one of the advantage of secondary data. This is particularly true when researchers use electronic retrieval to access data stored digitally. Now, because of digital technology, most of the researchers, they upload their articles into the internet, digital journals or digital websites. And it becomes very easy for me as a researcher to retrieve the data from such digital sources. And here also we should not forget that we should go for referencing whenever we take the data. So that's one of the important advantage for us as a researcher. So digital technology is in fact a blessing for the researcher now, as he can retrieve the data very faster. In many situations, collecting secondary data is instantaneous. As I already said, internet. So you need to just have an internet connection, then you can download any amount of data based upon your GB. So it's almost instantaneous retrieval of data. It eliminates many of the activities which are actually involved in primary data. You know what happens in primary data? You should collect the sample that you have to meet, and then you should process the data, because the data which is collected in primary source is a raw data that has to be processed to make it a meaningful information. So all these is involved in primary data, which is totally avoided in secondary data, because these steps are already taken by the previous researchers, and whatever the information I'm referring, it is a totally completely classified information, processed information. So I need not again process that information. So that's the advantage of secondary data. Secondary data are essential in cases where primary data cannot be collected very easily. So that's one of the important advantage of secondary data. Now let us try to understand where we can apply secondary data, or we can see the uses of secondary data. Definitely, secondary data helps us to address the problem, and will also sometimes helps to resolve the problem if you are referring the right data with the right inputs. It is a source of new ideas always, because always it is said that two minds are better than one. So when we try to understand the contributions made by other researchers, we get new ideas from them. We get new insights from them. That helps me to address my problem in a right way, helps define and provide better understanding of the problem, because my understanding is always limited. So when I try to study others' contribution through the secondary data, it broadens my understanding on the problem and helps me to solve the problem in a better way. Guidance for collection of primary data. As I already said, even in case of exploratory research, when I'm collecting the first-hand information, secondary data becomes a guide for the researcher. So he knows where is the starting point to collect the data only by understanding the secondary data. So that's one of the important insight here. A reference point for primary data is already said. By studying the secondary data, the researcher will know what is the reference point for collecting primary data. So those are some of the uses or benefits of the secondary data. As we saw in the primary data, there are four important sources: observation, we have seen interview, we have seen then questionnaire, and then schedule method also we had seen. Similarly, in secondary sources also, we have two important sources. One is the published data, data which is published by the people who have contributed it, which can be easily accessed, which can be easily retrieved. Sometimes the data is published. Here the researchers, they want their data to be used by others. And that will be a very good advantage for the researchers if it is published. Like it could be publications of central state, or sometimes it could be publications of the foreign journals. Then you have books and magazines, sometimes newspapers. We usually don't completely rely on newspapers, because newspaper data is not considered to be a reliable data because of the different factors are involved. We are not going to see that. We can still refer the newspapers, but we don't don't completely rely on the newspaper data. We had seen that same newspaper which says this is the right data one day, the same newspaper tomorrow may say that this is not a right data. So we have seen in many instances such data in the newspaper. So we should not completely rely on the newspaper as a source of data. Still, we can refer it. Reports and publications of various associations, trade associations, industrial associations, which are published. For example, we have in Bangalore many industrial associations. We have Bombadindra Industrial Association, we have Jigni, we have Electronic City. So they publish a lot of journals, they publish a lot of periodicals where you can get a lot of industry information. So that is again a source of data. Then you have reports prepared by research scholars, universities. We have some very good universities in India. Could be IIM, or it could be IITs, or we have open universities like IGNO. We have many good universities are there where they promote quality research. So that could be a very good source of information for me, especially if it is published. For example, in Shodh Ganga, you can see most of the thesis or put in Shodh Ganga, we can refer. And universities also, they promote publishing of their research, which becomes a good source for me. Public records and statistics. Okay, sometimes we may have to depend on public records also, like PWD is there. You have all the government departments. They come out with some data records. They publish in their websites. So we can even refer such data. So this is secondary data which is published, which can be easily accessed because it is published. But sometimes the data is not published. That is called as unpublished data. Uh, Keeping in view the privacy issue, professional secrecy, sometimes organizations or people may not publish their data, including like diaries of experts or researchers or letters, then unpublished biographies and autobiographies, which is very difficult to retrieve. Data with research scholars, which they feel is not good to publish in public. It will be a limited circulation, so it is very difficult to retrieve. Trade associations, labor bureaus, and other public and private individuals and organizations who, when they don't publish their data, it becomes a little difficult to locate the data. So that becomes a challenge now. So a researcher can refer to the published data or unpublished data. So that's about sources of secondary data. Now, we have seen about secondary data. Now, what is secondary data and how it is used, what are its benefits, and we had seen what are different sources of secondary data. Now, let us try to understand some of the good characteristics of secondary data. The data that we are selecting from any secondary source, whether it is a published data or it is a unpublished data, it should be reliable. That's very important aspect. It should be reliable. And then we move to the second aspect. When we say the data is reliable, what factors that we need to select or to identify to prove whether it's a reliable data or not that we are selecting from either published or unpublished. The first question that we need to ask is a researcher, who has collected the data? What were the sources of data? Was it collected from the right sources? Were they collected by using proper methods? Sometimes unethical practices also are used here to collect the data. At what time were they collected? If the data which I'm referring is too way back, for example, 10, 15 years back, now the question is how it is relevant for me now. So it's been almost 15, 20 years. Can I use the data? So time also is very important when we select. It is a test of reliability. Was there any bias of the compiler when the person who was compiling the data, was there any person bias involved in the compilation of the data? What level of accuracy was desired? Was there any accuracy desired by the person who was collecting? If yes, then I can refer the data, no problem. If not, then better to avoid such data. Was it achieved? So if it was achieved, if the accuracy was achieved, then I can proceed and I can use the data. Otherwise, better not to use the data. then suitability of data and adequacy of data. Is that secondary data useful for my study? That's very important. You can find ample amount of data in the internet or books or journals or various different sources of secondary data. You'll find lots of data, tons and tons of data. But is that data suitable for my study is what the question has to be asked. The first is reliability, whether the data that I am selecting through second source is reliable or not. If yes, go to the source and use the data. Second, is that data which I'm referring is suitable for my research? If yes, go forward and study the data. Is it adequate? Sometimes the data that you are referring may not be adequate for your study. So you should go for multiple sources of secondary data. So in one place, you may not get all the data. So you may have to refer to other sources. If it is not adequate, sometimes you should use the primary data also here, because the secondary data is not adequate. So to compensate this inadequacy, the researcher may have to conduct a primary research. Understand? So that's how these three qualities have to be seen to understand whether the secondary data is good or not good. Reliability of data, suitability of data, and adequacy of data. So these are some of the aspects. And finally, we have this final slide, which helps us to understand which is a good source of selecting data, whether it's a primary or secondary. So we cannot say, okay, primary is good than secondary, or secondary is bad than primary. We cannot conclude that. There are some factors which decide which has to be chosen. Let us see these factors now and try to understand how to select the right source of collecting the data. So my selection of primary source of data or secondary source of data depends upon my nature, scope, and object of the inquiry. For example, if the nature of my research is exploratory, then you should go for primary research, primary sources of collecting data, because you have very less awareness about the problem. There is no much literature available, secondary data available to refer. So you have to depend more on primary sources of data. If the nature of my research and scope and objective is descriptive in nature, where problem is clearly defined, there is enough literature available, variables are clearly identified, in such case, I depend more on the secondary data, as we already have seen in the previous slides. Okay, so this is the first determining factor. Second is availability of funds. If the researcher has an ample amount of funds, then he can launch into the primary sources of collecting data, which takes a lot of money. Could be interview or observation. We have seen different methods. But if the problem of funds is there for the researcher, then he has to depend on secondary data. So that's a decision point that he has to make. The availability of funds is one important aspect. Sometimes some organizations, they sponsor the researchers. In such case, yes, the researcher can go even for the primary sources also, because there is a supply of funds from an organization. For the freelance researchers, those who always have the problem of funds, they have to take a decision whether to go for primary or secondary. So if there is a cash crunch, if there is a fund issue, then usually researcher depends on secondary data, because it is less costly and very faster way of accessing the data. Time factor is another important aspect in deciding which source of data should be used. For example, in primary data, the techniques like interview or questionnaire or observation, it takes a lot of time to collect the data. If a researcher has enough time, then he can go for primary source. But if time is limited, then he should go for secondary data. It can be a mix of both, but time factor is very important for the researcher. Precision required. In case of primary data, the data which is collected is accurate, it's reliable. So high precision is there in primary data. But in case of secondary data, as it is collected by somebody else, so precision is not guaranteed. So here the researcher has to decide, okay, what is his objective? Is it precision or is just taking the data? So if he is looking for precision, then he has to go for primary. If not, he can depend on secondary sources of data if available. So these are some of the aspects. These are some of the aspects of the primary and secondary data. So in this session, we had seen about some of the miscellaneous techniques of collecting primary data, and then we moved to the secondary data, and we saw published and unpublished data and what are the good characteristics of secondary data. And also we have seen some of the determining factors in selecting the source of data, whether primary or secondary. So we should use these four aspects to decide which source of data to be used. So that's about collection of data. Let me brief the coming sessions, how we are going to have the coming sessions. The first, we have understood about collection of data. And we have seen in the beginning that unless until we are able to measure the data, we cannot subject it to statistical analysis. So measurement is very important, measurement of data. So in the coming sessions, we'll be talking about measurement scales, how to measure the data and how important it is in research, especially if we have to go for statistical analysis, we have to have a measurable data. Otherwise, we cannot go for statistical analysis. So in coming session, dear students, we'll be talking about the measurement scales, how to measure the data. Okay. So please go through all the stages that we have till now discussed, starting from identification, literature review, hypothesis, and then research design, and then collection of data. That is today's session. Okay, let's meet in the next session to discuss on measurement scales. Please come back to me if you have any doubts, any clarifications. I'll be glad to clarify those doubts. Okay. Thank you for your patient listening, and do remember to subscribe this channel to get more updates on research and more of my updates. Thank you for your patient listening. Have a great day. Thank you. Take care.